In the spring of 1945, the city where the Second World War in Europe had begun became the place where it would finally end block by block, in the rubble of its own capital. The regime that had promised a 1,000-year empire had just 12 years left, and in its final days, it was defended not by great armies, but by exhausted soldiers, old men, and teenage boys. This is the story of the fall of Berlin, the last battle of the war in Europe, and the overwhelming force that finally brought the Third Reich to an end. Let's break down how it actually happened. By April 1945, Nazi Germany was finished, and everyone but its leaders seemed to know it. In the West, American and British armies had crossed the Rhine and were driving deep into the country. In the East, the Soviet army was closing on the capital. The Soviet forces gathering outside Berlin were staggering: more than 2 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of artillery guns lined up almost wheel to wheel. It was one of the largest concentrations of firepower ever assembled for a single battle. Against them, the defenders of Berlin were a shadow of the army that had once conquered Europe. Some units were still hardened veterans, but many were now boys of the Hitler Youth and old men of the Home Guard, handed rifles and anti-tank rockets and told to hold a city against the tide. To reach the city, the Soviets first had to break through the last prepared German defenses on high ground to the east, along the Seelow Heights. On the 16th of April, 1945, the assault began with a bombardment so vast that the ground itself seemed to shake. Soviet commander Georgy Zhukov threw his men forward, but the German defenses were dug in, and the marshy ground and dug-in guns turned the attack into a killing field. For several days, the fighting was brutal and the Soviet losses were heavy, but there was no stopping the sheer weight of numbers. The heights fell, the last major barrier before the capital was gone, and now the road to Berlin lay open. Here is the part that sealed Berlin's fate. The Soviets did not simply push into the city from one side. Two massive fronts, one led by Zhukov, the other by his great rival Ivan Konov, swung around the capital from the north and the south. By the 25th of April, the two arms met on the far side of Berlin. The city was completely surrounded. On that same day, far to the west, Soviet and American soldiers met and shook hands on the banks of the Elbe River, a symbol that Germany had been cut in two. Inside the ring, more than 1 million people were trapped: soldiers, home guard, and terrified civilians. The battle now moved into the streets, and it became some of the most desperate urban fighting of the entire war. Soviet troops fought their way in from the outskirts toward the center, where the great government buildings stood. Every street was a battlefield. Defenders fired from windows, cellars, and rooftops. Tanks rolled forward and were knocked out by boys with handheld rockets hiding in the rubble. Soviet assault groups cleared the city one building at a time, paying for each block in blood. And beneath the shattered city, deep under the government district, the leaders of the Reich were hiding in a concrete bunker, still issuing orders to armies that no longer existed. By the last days of April, the Soviet army had fought its way to the heart of the government quarter. There was nowhere left to run. On the 30th of April, 1945, as Soviet troops closed in just streets away, Adolf Hitler took his own life in his bunker. The man who had plunged the world into war would not live to see the final surrender. The dream of the 1,000-year Reich died with him in a cellar beneath a burning city. Above ground, the fighting reached its final symbol. Soviet soldiers battled their way into the Reichstag, the great parliament building, and raised the red flag over its roof. The photograph of that moment would become one of the most famous images of the entire war. On the 2nd of May, the Berlin garrison surrendered. Days later, on the 8th of May, Germany surrendered unconditionally, and the war in Europe was finally over. The fall of Berlin holds a hard and lasting lesson. The war was already lost long before the final battle, yet the regime chose to fight to the very last building and the cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides were killed in those final weeks. Countless civilians died in a battle whose outcome was never in doubt. Boys and old men were thrown into a fight their leaders had already lost for a cause that was already dead. That is the real story of the last days of the Third Reich. Not a heroic last stand, but the final, needless price of a war that one man refused to end, paid by the people of the city where it had all begun. But Berlin was not Hitler's last gamble. Months before the city fell, he had thrown his final reserves into one massive, desperate attack in the west, a surprise offensive through a snow-covered forest that nearly changed the end of the war. That was the Battle of the Bulge, and it's the story we'll break down next. If you want to see Hitler's last roll of the dice, subscribe, and we'll see you there.